I've often thought about the years before that night, the ordinary days that felt so uneventful at the time, but in hindsight were quietly shaping me for moments like this. My life, like many women of my generation, had been full of small, almost invisible sacrifices. I had learned early on that keeping a home, keeping a family together, and keeping peace sometimes required putting your own needs aside. It wasn't bitterness I felt about this. It was simply the way life had unfolded. And yet, it also meant that I had a foundation of quiet patience, a resilience that people only notice when they are confronted with situations that could easily break someone else. I remember when my son was young. He was full of life, always asking questions, always moving from one thing to another, never content to sit still. My husband and I would look at each other and smile, exhausted but happy, because raising him required every ounce of energy we had. There were mornings when I woke before the sun to prepare breakfast, pack his school bag, and make sure he was dressed neatly for the day. I would tie his shoelaces, comb his hair, and try to coax him to eat something healthy, all while keeping my own breakfast cold on the counter. Those were small, invisible acts of love, the kind no one notices until they look back years later. As he grew older, the responsibilities shifted. Homework, arguments with friends, after-school activities, and endless questions about life and fairness became a constant hum in the background of our home. I learned to listen patiently, even when I was tired, to help without judgment, to guide without insisting. My husband and I worked together, each of us quietly aware that our strength as parents was in our ability to endure, to support, and to remain calm when tempers flared. That calm became a silent promise to each other, a backbone that carried us through years of ordinary life. And then, of course, came the day when my son met his future wife. She was younger, bright, with opinions and energy that matched his. I welcomed her into the family, as one should, because love is meant to grow and be nurtured, not restricted. At first, she was polite, respectful, and kind. She laughed at our jokes, listened to our stories, and gradually became part of the rhythm of our household. But as months passed, I noticed subtle changes. She began to assert herself in ways that weren't aggressive, not overtly, but in small, insistent ways. She would rearrange things in the kitchen without asking, suggest changes to routines that had been in place for years, or offer opinions on matters that were personal to me and my husband. I brushed most of it aside, because I wanted to maintain harmony. It never occurred to me that these small incursions were signs of a deeper struggle for control. Life continued with its familiar rhythm. My mornings were quiet and predictable. I would wake, prepare tea, and check on my son before school. I would exchange a few words with my daughter-in-law, mostly casual and polite, the way family members do when they're trying to coexist. There were times she asked for advice, and I gave it freely. Other times, I stayed silent, knowing that sometimes guidance is best offered without expectation. And yet, behind her polite exterior, I began to sense impatience, a desire for things to move faster, to change the structure of our home in ways I had not anticipated. We had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and festivals together. I had baked cakes, decorated tables, and prepared meals for large gatherings. I had helped her find her way into the family without forcing my own ways upon her. I tried to give her space, to let her carve out her own role, to find her place in the rhythm of our home. And still, sometimes I would notice the impatience in her eyes, a subtle pressure that pressed against the walls of the life I had built over decades. I chose not to confront it immediately because I believed in patience, in calm, in the quiet hope that respect would grow over time. My husband, too, had his moments of tension. We had lived together long enough to know each other's weaknesses and strengths. He was a good man, but he had his blind spots, his tendencies to avoid conflict, to smooth over problems rather than address them head-on. It was both a strength and a challenge. Together, we had navigated years of parenting, financial stress, and the quiet, constant work of maintaining a home. We had survived everything, or at least that was how it felt until that evening that brought all the subtle pressures to the surface in the most dramatic, painful way. I often think back to the small, ordinary moments that led up to that night. The quiet evenings when my daughter-in-law would linger in the kitchen, reorganizing cupboards, shifting things around, and claiming corners of the house without a word. The afternoons when she would criticize small habits, sometimes under the guise of advice. I didn't argue. I didn't insist. I stayed silent because I believed in preserving peace, in letting her find her place. and in trusting that my role as matriarch would always be respected without me needing to declare it. Even the children, my grandchildren, played a role in shaping this tension. They were precious, full of energy and innocence, often unaware of the subtle conflicts brewing in the background. I loved them dearly, and I tried to protect them from discord, smoothing over arguments and keeping the house calm. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought my silence, my patience, my constant presence was enough to keep everything together. But life, I realized slowly, doesn't always reward patience. Sometimes it tests it, stretches it, bends it, to see what remains when the pressure grows too strong. And I could feel, over the months leading to that evening, that the pressure was growing. The small incidents, the subtle signs were accumulating like weight on a scale. And the day my daughter-in-law demanded the keys, the day she slapped me, it was as if that invisible weight had finally tipped the balance. And all the years of small sacrifices and quiet endurance were brought into sharp relief. I had spent decades building a life, a home, and a family. I had nurtured relationships, cultivated understanding, and maintained calm in the face of minor conflicts, always choosing dialogue over confrontation, patience over anger. And yet, that night reminded me that endurance alone cannot prevent someone from challenging the boundaries you have quietly established. It was a lesson, painful but clear, that respect is never automatic, that patience has its limits, and that sometimes silence becomes your shield. Even as I reflect on those years, I can remember the tiny, almost imperceptible moments that shaped the person I became, the woman who could sit unmoved in the face of aggression, who could maintain calm when anger demanded a reaction. Each evening spent making dinner, each morning preparing breakfast, each quiet conversation with a child, each effort to give love without expectation, it all added up to a reservoir of strength I didn't fully appreciate until I needed it most. Those years had not been glamorous, nor had they been easy. There were aches and disappointments, arguments and misunderstandings, moments of loneliness and quiet tears behind closed doors. And yet, they also built resilience, patience, and an understanding of human nature that was both comforting and essential. I had learned to read the subtle signs, to listen with more than my ears, to understand without the need for words. And it was this quiet understanding, cultivated over decades, that allowed me to face that evening without fear or reaction, simply observing, simply existing, and simply holding on to the dignity that had always been mine. It was just another quiet evening, the kind where the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for nothing in particular to happen. I was sitting in the living room, the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock keeping me company. My hands were folded over my lap, and I felt the weight of the day in my bones, not the kind of exhaustion that comes from work, but the kind that quietly settles in after years of doing everything quietly, for everyone else. I had spent decades keeping this family together, making sure the house ran smoothly, making sure everyone's needs were met before my own. And I had grown accustomed to the background of life, unnoticed, uncelebrated, but quietly present. It had been a long day. The sun had set hours ago, and the house had that soft golden glow that only the living room lamp could give. Outside, the wind rustled the trees gently, brushing against the windows like it was trying not to disturb anything. I had just made myself a cup of tea and was thinking of sitting down with my knitting when I heard the front door open. Not the usual soft click of my son returning from work, or even the hurried shuffle of a child dropping in. No, this was different. It was louder, abrupt, almost demanding, and it carried the energy of someone who thought they owned the space the moment they stepped inside. My daughter-in-law had come in without knocking. That wasn't unusual. Exactly, she often came and went as she pleased, but that night there was a hardness in her steps. I looked up from my cup, expecting a smile, a word, maybe a light-hearted comment about her day, something ordinary. But instead, I saw the expression on her face, and I felt a cold prickle run down my spine. It was frustration, yes, but more than that, it was insistence, a sharp kind of authority that made it clear she was here for one thing, and one thing only. And then she spoke. Her words didn't begin as a storm, but they carried it, as if the air itself had changed. "Give me the house keys," she said. Simple, direct. But the tone, the way it came out, demanded obedience, not conversation. I felt my chest tighten. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just looked at her, the teacup trembling slightly in my hands. I had known her for years, enough to know that behind her polite smiles and occasional laughter, there was a certain sharpness, a desire to control, that now had taken form in this single sentence. "What?" I finally said, quietly. My voice barely carried across the room. I could feel her eyes on me, burning almost, and I realized immediately that she expected no question, no hesitation. I could feel the tension in the room tighten, wrapping around us like an invisible cord. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and relentless. I said the house keys. "Now," she repeated, her tone sharper this time, leaving no room for discussion. I stayed silent. I could feel my lips pressed together, my hands gripping the cup, my mind spinning with questions I had no intention of voicing. How had it come to this? When had the house, the home I had built with my own hands, become a space where I no longer had the authority or even the right to speak without fear? And then it happened. The slap was quick, sharp, and unexpected. It wasn't a playful tap, nor was it the result of a miscommunication. It was deliberate, intended to shock, to force compliance. My cheek stung, and yet, in that instant, I felt a strange clarity. I did not flinch. I did not cry out. I stayed seated, my hands still over my lap, and I looked at her calmly. There was silence after that, thick, heavy, almost unbearable. I could hear her breathing, quick, sharp, as if she had expected me to crumble, to yell, to protest. But I did none of those things. I thought about all the years I had spent here, all the mornings I had woken up early to prepare breakfast, all the nights I had stayed up making sure the family had everything they needed. I had raised my children with care, guided them with patience, and I had opened my home to anyone who needed it. I had never demanded respect, had never raised my voice, had never used force to make anyone obey. But this moment felt like the culmination of everything I had endured in silence. Everything I had allowed because I believed that love and patience could outweigh anger and aggression. She stood there, keys clenched in her fist as if she had won something. But I could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had expected a reaction, a fight, a plea, something. But I gave her none of it. I stayed silent. And in that silence, I realized something crucial. That night, the house, this home, was still mine, not because of keys or walls or doors, but because of the quiet strength I had built over decades. I didn't need to raise my voice, to fight, or to retaliate. My silence, calm and unwavering, was the only power I needed. As the minutes stretched, neither of us spoke. I could feel the weight of her gaze, sharp and questioning. And yet, I did not move. I did not reach for the keys. I did not try to take them from her. I simply waited. Something shifted in that quiet, tense space. She realized, perhaps, that the authority she tried to assert was fragile. That the home, the family, and the history here could not be claimed by force or threat. I sipped my tea slowly, feeling the warmth spread through me. My heart was still racing, but my mind was clear. I had learned long ago that strength was not always loud. That sometimes, the most powerful thing one could do was remain calm when chaos came barging in. I thought about my son, about the years we had spent together as a family, and about the choices we make when tempers flare and emotions run high. That night, I stayed silent. I did not argue. I did not plead. I did not try to explain. I simply stayed, rooted in my presence, letting the moment unfold without giving it the satisfaction of a reaction. And in that quiet, I realized that sometimes staying silent is not weakness. Sometimes, staying silent is the clearest way to protect yourself and to claim your dignity. It was late by the time she finally left, the keys still in her hand, the house quiet once more. I sat in the dim light, the sting on my cheek fading, but the memory of the moment etched into me. I did not cry. I did not rage. I simply breathed slowly, letting the calmness settle back into my bones. That night, I understood something important. Silence could be stronger than anger. Patience stronger than force, and presence stronger than threats. I would remember that evening for the rest of my life, not for the slap, not for the demand, not for the confrontation, but for the quiet strength I discovered in myself when it mattered most. It was a lesson in dignity, a reminder of all I had endured, and a promise to myself that no one could ever take that away, even now. I sometimes replay that night in my mind, not with bitterness, not with regret, but with a quiet understanding of what it means to stand firm without moving, to be unshaken when others try to unbalance you. It is a strange kind of power, and it is one I have never taken for granted. After that night, the house felt different. It wasn't that anything had changed physically, the furniture remained the same, the walls held the same faded paint, and the photographs on the mantel were still smiling faces frozen in time. But there was an invisible shift, a quiet tension that settled over everything like a shadow. I could feel it the moment I woke in the mornings, the moment I poured my first cup of tea, even in the pauses between conversations. My daughter-in-law's presence had changed from energetic familiarity to something heavier, more insistent, like a storm cloud waiting to drop rain without warning. In the days that followed, small incidents began to pile up. A misplaced dish, a slightly altered routine, a casual remark that carried a sharp edge. Each one seemed minor, almost insignificant, and yet together they created an undercurrent of discomfort. She would comment on the way I arranged the kitchen, or question the way I disciplined my grandchildren, or suggest that certain household decisions should now be hers to make. I could have argued. I could have pushed back. But I had learned long ago that confrontation rarely solves anything when emotions are heightened. Instead, I listened, stayed quiet, and observed. My son, caught between us, seemed unaware of the subtle escalation. He was busy with work, with his own life, and I suspect he didn't notice the growing tension until it could no longer be ignored. I didn't blame him. I had learned that family dynamics are complicated, that sometimes the ones closest to you can't see the strain because it doesn't touch them directly. But still, it hurt to realize that the quiet battles I fought were invisible to the people who mattered most. One evening, a few weeks after the first confrontation, my daughter-in-law began rearranging the living room while I sat nearby, reading quietly. She moved furniture, changed cushions, adjusted curtains, all without a word. I watched her carefully, not because I intended to intervene, but because I wanted to understand her intentions. There was a certain urgency in the way she moved, a determination to imprint her mark on a space that had been ours for decades. I realized then that it wasn't just about the keys or the house, it was about control, ownership, and asserting authority over a life she was still learning to navigate. At dinner that night, she brought up topics with an edge I hadn't noticed before. Maybe we should start doing things differently, she said casually, but her eyes held a weight, a challenge. She wasn't asking, she was declaring. She suggested changes to routines I had maintained for years, to rules I had set quietly but firmly, to the very rhythms that had kept the household running smoothly. I replied softly, keeping my tone even, careful not to escalate tension. But inside, I felt the quiet stirrings of unease. This was more than impatience. It was a test, a slow push to see how far she could go before I reacted. The days became a pattern. I would wake, prepare the house, and try to navigate the subtleties of her presence. She tested boundaries in small, deliberate ways, observing my reactions or lack thereof. Sometimes she would ask for advice and then dismiss it. Sometimes she would give instructions as if she were in charge. I could feel the tension mounting, a slow pressure that built with each incident. I realized that her behavior was no longer accidental or situational. It was intentional. She was asserting herself, measuring me, exploring the limits of patience and silence. I started noticing subtle changes in my own behavior as well. I spoke less, moved more carefully, and measured every word. I had always believed in the power of calm and observation, but even I felt the strain. Sleep was sometimes interrupted by worry, small scenarios playing in my mind over and over, imagining what might happen next. I reminded myself constantly that responding with anger or frustration would only give her power she was seeking. I had learned the value of patience, the strength of silence, but even the strongest patience can be tested. There were moments that almost felt like victories for her. She would smile after successfully changing a routine or persuading my son to agree with her ideas. I could see the satisfaction in her eyes, the quiet sense that she had won some invisible battle. And yet, I reminded myself that patience, consistency, and observation were my tools, not force or confrontation. I could not allow frustration or fear to dictate my actions. I needed to remain steady. Even as the tension in the household grew with each passing day, I also began to notice subtle manipulations. Conversations were framed to make me feel uncertain. Suggestions came disguised as helpful advice, but carried the weight of obligation. Requests were presented as necessities, with an expectation that compliance would be immediate and unquestioned. She tested the boundaries of respect and authority, seeing how much she could demand before my calm would crack. And in those moments, I realized the depth of the challenge before me. This was no longer about simple disagreements. This was about asserting control over a family and a home I had helped nurture for decades, and yet, even as the pressure mounted, I found a strange clarity. I understood her motives, the desire for recognition, for influence, for establishing a sense of authority in a household that had always had a quiet structure. I recognized the fear, the insecurity, and the need for validation that lay beneath the assertiveness. Understanding didn't mean condoning, but it allowed me to navigate the situation with care, to anticipate moves, and to protect my own dignity. The children were caught in the middle. I watched how they responded, sometimes mirroring her behavior, sometimes withdrawing into themselves. It was heartbreaking, realizing that the dynamics between adults could ripple through the youngest members of the family. I tried to shield them, to maintain calm routines, and to reassure them that despite the tension, the household still had stability. I reminded myself that my role wasn't only to endure, it was to provide a safe, calm space in which they could feel secure. Even as the undercurrents of conflict swirled around us, then there were the moments of confrontation that never erupted into violence, but carried a weight of quiet pressure. A question asked too sharply, a remark with a hidden edge, a glance that implied accusation. Each instance tested my resolve. I felt the rising tension as a physical presence, pressing against my chest, and yet I remained seated, quiet, calm, observing and absorbing, without allowing her actions to dictate my emotions. I began to understand that this was not about winning or losing in a conventional sense. It was about maintaining integrity, presence, and composure in the face of someone trying to disrupt it. As the weeks went on, the household became a delicate balancing act. Every interaction required thoughtfulness, every word measured. I noticed how she sought allies, subtly influencing my son's perceptions, presenting ideas and suggestions that made me appear less capable, less decisive. I felt the subtle pressure building, a test of endurance, patience, and emotional strength. And through it all, I reminded myself constantly of what I had learned over decades, that silence and calm could be more powerful than anger and confrontation, and that a steady, unwavering presence could withstand even the most persistent attempts at manipulation. I also reflected on my own emotions. I felt frustration, of course, and a deep sadness that the home I had nurtured with love was being challenged so aggressively. But I also felt a growing sense of determination. I had endured years of life's small injustices, the invisible labor of raising children, maintaining a home, and supporting family members without recognition. I had learned to navigate difficult people with patience and quiet strength. And now, that skill was being tested in a very personal, very direct way. Through it all, I stayed silent. I listened more than I spoke, observed more than I reacted, and tried to understand the motivations behind each action. I began to see patterns, the moments when she was most assertive, the subtle ways she tried to manipulate situations, the emotional triggers she tested. And in that awareness, I found a quiet power. It wasn't the kind of power that demands attention or recognition. It was the kind that comes from knowing yourself, your history, your strength, and your limits. I realized that even in the midst of rising conflict, I had the ability to remain calm, composed, and in control of my own responses. Each day became a slow burn, a careful navigation through a house filled with tension, unspoken rules, and emotional pressure. I could feel the strain, yes, but I also felt my own resolve solidifying. This was a test not just of endurance, but of dignity, patience, and quiet authority. And even though the conflict was rising, even though her actions were becoming more deliberate and more challenging, I understood one fundamental truth: I could control only myself, my reactions, and my presence. And that, I realized, might be more powerful than anything she could demand to take from me. It was a Sunday afternoon when everything came to a head, though I didn't know it at the time. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you listen to every little sound, from the ticking of the clock to the faint hum of the refrigerator. I was sitting in the living room, my hands folded over my lap, sipping tea, as I often did on these slow afternoons. My son was out running errands, and my daughter-in-law had been unusually quiet, moving about the house without speaking more than a word or two. At first, I thought perhaps she was tired, or maybe she was preparing for one of her sudden bursts of activity. But soon, the sense of tension returned, heavier than before. A weight pressing down on me like it was physically present. She approached me quietly, her eyes fixed on mine with a mixture of determination and something I couldn't quite place. I could feel my heart rate quicken, though I reminded myself to stay calm. I had learned long ago that reacting in anger only gives the other person what they want, the satisfaction of a fight, the control over emotion. I remained seated, my hands folded, my gaze steady. She stopped in front of me and without warning, slapped me across the cheek. Sharp, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. I felt the sting, the heat of it spreading across my skin, and yet I did not flinch. I did not cry out. I did not respond. I simply looked at her calmly, observing every detail, every emotion flashing across her face. Then came the words that I will never forget. "I want the house keys. Now. You have no right to keep them." Her voice was firm, demanding, yet underneath there was something more: impatience, fear, perhaps even desperation. It was in that moment, as I stayed silent, that I realized this was no longer about control or pride. This was about something else entirely, something deeper, something hidden. I did not reach for the keys. I did not argue. I did not protest. I simply stayed where I was, quiet, calm, allowing the tension to fill the room. And then I saw it, an almost imperceptible glance, a flicker of fear in her eyes. She had expected a reaction. She had expected me to beg, to argue, to raise my voice. But there was nothing, only silence, only presence. And in that silence, something shifted. It was later that evening, after she had gone, that I discovered the truth. My son had left his phone on the kitchen counter, notifications blinking across the screen. At first, I thought nothing of it, until a message preview caught my eye. The words were simple, casual, even, but the sender's identity and the content made my chest tighten. There were conversations, carefully hidden, exchanged over weeks, that revealed her plan. She was not simply asserting control over the household. She had been systematically trying to manipulate my son, to influence decisions, to isolate me quietly from the family I had built. The betrayal was staggering. Not because she had been angry or impatient that I could understand, but because she had planned it all along, carefully, deliberately. Each act of assertiveness, each small argument, each insistence on the keys, had been part of a larger strategy. She had underestimated me, assumed that silence meant weakness, that patience would break before the force of her demands. But silence is not weakness. Patience is not ignorance. And decades of quiet endurance had prepared me for this very moment. I spent that night reflecting on every interaction I had had with her over the months, piecing together the subtle signs I had overlooked, the small manipulations, the casual suggestions that carried weight, the way she positioned herself as the authority in my own home. They all pointed to something deliberate. I realized she had been testing me all along, gauging my reactions, exploring the limits of my patience. And now, the final confrontation with the keys had brought everything into sharp focus. When my son returned home, I chose my words carefully. I did not accuse. I did not demand. I spoke softly, recounting the facts, the patterns, and the truth as I had observed it. I watched him process the information, watched the confusion, the doubt, and the realization pass across his face. He had been unaware of her manipulation, caught in the middle between loyalty and love. And now he had to confront a truth that he had not anticipated. The revelation changed the dynamics in the house almost immediately. My daughter-in-law, who had appeared so confident, so in control, was now hesitant, careful, as if the power she had tried to seize had slipped through her fingers. She had assumed that her actions would go unnoticed, that her plan would unfold without interruption. But she had not counted on the quiet observer, the matriarch who had endured years of invisible labor, who had cultivated patience and clarity through decades of family life. I had seen her strategy in full, and now the house was no longer hers to command. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving who was right or wrong. It was about exposing the truth calmly, without drama, without escalation. The moment of betrayal had been devastating, yes, but it also revealed something essential: that deliberate, careful observation, paired with patience and silence, could reveal more than anger or confrontation ever could. In that revelation, I found strength, clarity, and a renewed understanding of the boundaries that could never be crossed again. That night, as I prepared for bed, I reflected on the lessons learned. I realized that betrayal often comes disguised as familiarity, as care, as casual insistence. It can be subtle, building over time, until a single action like demanding keys or issuing a slap exposes the underlying truth. And yet, even in the face of such betrayal, there is a choice to respond in kind or to maintain calm, dignity, and quiet authority. I had chosen the latter, and in doing so, I discovered the depth of my own strength. The house felt different after that evening, not in its walls, or its furniture, or its decorations, but in the quiet understanding of who truly held power. Not through force or intimidation, but through clarity, patience, and resilience. I had endured the betrayal, witnessed the manipulation, and yet remained calm and present. And in that calm, I realized that the truest authority in a household, the kind that cannot be taken by demand or force, comes from presence, integrity, and the quiet knowledge of one's own worth. In the days that followed the revelation, the atmosphere in the house slowly shifted. It wasn't dramatic, and there were no loud confrontations or accusations shouted across rooms. Instead, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a tide changing beneath the surface. My daughter-in-law became quieter, more measured in her movements, more careful in her words. She no longer issued demands or tried to assert control in the small ways that had previously been a constant source of tension. Her confidence had been shaken not through punishment or anger, but through the calm clarity of truth. I noticed my son observing her in a new light as well. He began to see the patterns I had described, the small manipulations, the insistences that were not about family harmony but about asserting dominance. At first, he looked confused, perhaps even guilty, realizing how unaware he had been of the emotional landscape unfolding around him. Slowly, he began to step back, to create space for reflection, and to recognize that the household did not belong to one person or one perspective alone. It belonged to all of us, and respect could not be demanded through force, it had to be given and earned. The children sensed the change too. Without words, they recognized the difference in energy, the newfound calm in the home. The tension that had pressed on them like an invisible weight was beginning to lift. There was laughter again in small doses, the quiet ease of family life returning in gentle increments. I observed them, feeling a quiet satisfaction, because maintaining a safe and stable environment for them had always been one of my primary responsibilities. That, in many ways, felt like the truest victory. The children could feel the shift without needing to understand all the details. I also noticed the small ways in which my daughter-in-law began to adjust. She asked for input rather than issuing instructions. She consulted rather than demanded. And in those subtle changes, I could see the emergence of respect, not forced, not coerced, but genuine. She had realized, perhaps too late, that true authority does not come from raising your voice or claiming ownership, but from understanding, cooperation, and trust. It was not a dramatic reconciliation, and there were no grand apologies. Instead, there was a quiet realignment of roles, boundaries, and expectations, a recalibration that restored balance to the household. In private moments, my son came to me and spoke quietly, acknowledging what he had overlooked for months. He admitted that he had been caught between us, unsure of how to navigate the growing tension, and grateful that I had handled the situation with calm and patience rather than confrontation. I listened, offering reassurance and a gentle reminder that family life is often messy and complicated, and that learning from these experiences is what strengthens bonds over time. It was a conversation rooted in understanding rather than blame, a necessary step toward healing the subtle fractures that had formed. The real payoff, I realized, was in the restored equilibrium. The home that had once felt tense and unpredictable regained its rhythm. Morning routines, evening meals, and small household tasks flowed with the quiet familiarity they had once held. My presence, once challenged, was no longer questioned. I had demonstrated that authority, patience, and quiet observation could withstand even deliberate attempts at disruption. And in doing so, I had created a model for my family, a reminder that calm, reasoned action often holds more power than anger or aggression. I also began to reflect on the lessons this experience had offered me personally. I had been tested in ways that were both emotional and psychological, confronted with manipulation and aggression in my own home. And yet, I had survived, not through force, but through clarity, presence, and patience. I realized that these qualities, cultivated over decades of raising children and maintaining a household, had provided me with the tools to navigate even the most challenging interpersonal dynamics. The sense of inner strength that came from enduring and observing, rather than reacting impulsively, was profound. Over time, my daughter-in-law and I reached a new understanding. We were not close in the way that friends might be, nor was there an immediate warmth that erased the past. But there was mutual recognition, a silent acknowledgement of boundaries and respect. The house was no longer a battleground. We could coexist without fear or manipulation. In many ways, this quiet resolution felt more significant than any dramatic confrontation could have been. It was the restoration of order, dignity, and stability, all achieved without raising a hand, shouting a word, or compromising my own values. There were also practical consequences. Certain responsibilities were realigned in the household, with clear expectations and agreements about decision-making. My son took on a more active role in mediating family dynamics, ensuring that no one person could dominate or disrupt harmony. The children benefited from this newfound balance, thriving in an environment that was predictable, safe, and emotionally steady. And I, having endured the challenge, felt a renewed sense of confidence in my own ability to navigate difficult situations with grace. I often reflect on the significance of that evening. The slap and the demand for the keys. It was not simply an act of aggression. It was a catalyst for clarity. It revealed underlying tensions, exposed manipulation, and forced a recalibration of relationships within the household. And through it all, I remained silent, calm, and present, a witness to the unfolding of events rather than a participant in chaos. That silence, that steadfast composure, became a quiet instrument of justice and understanding. The emotional payoff was subtle but powerful. I experienced a renewed sense of respect from my family, a restoration of the boundaries I had quietly maintained for years. I also witnessed growth and reflection in my daughter-in-law and my son, who began to understand the importance of empathy, patience, and the impact of their actions. The household, once tense and fraught with silent conflict, regained its rhythm, and with it, a sense of peace that had been absent for too long. In hindsight, I understand that moments of betrayal and confrontation, while painful, often serve as catalysts for deeper understanding and growth. They reveal character, clarify values, and illuminate the strength that lies within quiet endurance. That night, and the days that followed, taught me that dignity, patience, and calm observation are more powerful than anger or aggression, and that maintaining one's presence and integrity can shift dynamics more effectively than force ever could.